Hi everyone. Today I'm going to begin the third chapter that is called The Afterlife. It begins on page 33. Although I'm going to continue to model making personal connections and visualizing scenes, I'm also going to start modeling asking questions while reading. I will identify whether I'm making a thin or a thick question, but I am going to have you begin to create your own thin and thick questions as we continue to read the novel. The Afterlife. The day's first squirt of sunlight hit the window. The bus changed gears. Brent opened his eyes. They were climbing through mountains now. The other passengers around him were sleeping. Twitched alert by the light, he craned his neck to get a better view, pressed his head to the tinted glass, and raptly observed the sun's rising. After night came another day, and after death, another life. Morning seemed mysterious gifts. He inspected the dawn with fascination. The bus's gears growled. Behind him, he heard a faint conversation in another language. This is the afterlife, he told himself. To be crowded in with a collection of strangers, plunging through a foreign landscape, headed toward an unknown destiny. The bus was his ferry across the river Styx. It descended now into an unlit valley. Brent squinted at his map and realized he was in the Cascades. Seattle wasn't far off. So one of the thing questions I have is, where is Seattle? And I don't know actually if there are more Seattles than one, but I am thinking of Seattle in the state of Washington. Now, if we remember, Brent lives in Chicago. So another thin question that I can come up with right now is, how many miles is Seattle from Chicago? And I haven't looked that up. If you find the answer to that question and email me the answer, then I will give you extra credit. He'd been writing for 2 days, watching new souls board in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Fargo, Bozeman, Butte, Coeur d'Alene, Spokane. He'd speculated on their previous lives. He had surprisingly little interest in his own. His second life had eclipsed his first. Its moment of birth had been the crash. He didn't remember the actual impact. He did recall the ambulance lights, the policeman asking how he felt, the discovery that he'd escaped with only cuts and a minor head injury. Then came the alcohol test. Then the drive to the police station, being booked for drunk driving, the photographs and fingerprints, registering his new birth, he thought now. Then the realization that the ambulance at the scene had been tending someone else, that he'd hit another car. His father had arrived at the station. There was talk of the Chevy, its back end mangled, the car probably totaled. Then the news, delivered by one of the officers, that the woman he'd hit had died. So what I'd like you to do right now is pause for a moment and try to remember what you wrote as your prediction for what happened at the end of the chapter called Party Time. I believe it is slide 6, and I want you to go, and on slide 7 there's a new journal entry that I put in all of your whirligig journal entries, and I want you to confirm or adjust your prediction based on what I just read. So pause now, and I'll see you in a couple minutes. Now that you've confirmed and adjusted your prediction about what happened at the end of the first chapter called Party Time, we are going to continue. The muteness had begun in that moment. He spoke not at all driving home with his father, slept 14 hours, and didn't speak the next day. He remembered the party and that he'd tried to kill himself. That he'd ended up killing someone else left him frozen, numb from scalp to soles. This type of soul is not the soul within a person, it's the sole of your shoe. And it's spelled S-O-L-E-S as opposed to S-O-U-L-S. Words returned on the second day. His turmoil, though, wasn't translatable into words. His mother got rid of the newspaper that had a story about the crash, but Brent dug it out of the bottom of the trash can. His car had apparently hit the divider, spun, then been struck by the driver behind him. His blood alcohol was 0.11. The story was brief and gave only the victim's name, age, and residence. Leah Zamora, 18, Chicago. Now I'd like you to pause and try to remember a time that we've heard that name before, Leah Zamora. And I want you again, after I'm done speaking, to pause this video and return to slide 9, where you made a prediction about what you thought what was written on the wooden part of the whirligig meant. It was Leah Rosalia Santos Zamora. And I want you on slide 10, it's already added onto your whirligig journal entries, to confirm or adjust that prediction that you made on slide 9. I'll see you in a couple minutes. On page 35, we'll continue. He plumbed those few facts. She was nearly his own age. He was determined to know more. He tried the obituaries, but her name wasn't listed. He rummaged through the trash for the following day's paper, turned to the gravy-stained obituaries, and found her. Daughter of Caesar and Tamara Zamora, senior at Niles North High School, an honor student, member of the student council, the orchestra, the track team, active in the Filipino community, volunteer at Resurrection Hospital. Why did he have to kill someone like that? Then he realized with a surge of relief that he could perhaps go to the funeral. The police had confiscated his license, but he could take a cab, stand in the back, leave an anonymous offering of some kind. He checked the paper. It had been held the day before. He ate little, spoke little, and no longer listened to music. He turned 17, an event he scarcely noticed. He heard his parents whisper about the blow to his head and his personality change. He'd been diagnosed with a mild concussion. The headaches, like a wrecking ball, working on his skull came less often, replaced by the endless tolling in his mind of the word murderer. Everyone knew. He refused to go to school and made arrangements to finish his classwork at home. He disliked being seen in his neighborhood, where the glances he drew were too long or too short. Among strangers, he felt no less an outcast, their blind assumption that he was one of them making him wince inside. He studied their carefree innocence with envy. An old woman reading on a bench in a mall, a baby sleeping in a stroller, a pretzel seller joking with a customer. He was no longer of their kind and never would be. There was a hearing with a judge soon after the crash. Like a ghost, Brent listened to other people discuss the accident and his fate. He was charged with DUI and manslaughter. He hadn't contested his guilt. His punishment was the issue at hand. The judge asked for more information and set a date for a second hearing. It was then that the interviewing began. Social workers and psychologists questioned him, his parents, his friends. He found the fact that he tried to kill himself impossible to share with another soul. He could scarcely believe he'd actually tried it and wondered how he could have given no thought to the other cars he would hit. His parents hired their own lawyer and a psychologist. Their job was to argue that sending him to the juvenile detention center would be detrimental to his worrisome mental state. His father tried to cheer him up, promising he would serve no time, telling him to put it behind him, assuring him people would forget. "I won't," Brent answered silently. He took the obituary from its hiding place, looked up Caesar Zamora in the phone book, and spent all of one day composing what became a 4-sentence apology. He mailed it on a Monday. The reply came on Friday, an envelope with his own letter inside, mutilated with scissors, stabbed, defaced with cigarette burns. So I might pause and think to myself, what happened to his mail that he sent to the Zamoras? And it's a thin question because I can actually find the answer. The answer is on page 37 that we're reading. An envelope came to Brent, quote, with his own letter inside, mutilated with scissors, stabbed, defaced with cigarette burns, unquote. Now, a thick question I can ask also is, how do you think the parents felt receiving that mail? What kind of emotions does mutilating Brent's letter, stabbing it, burning it with cigarettes, suggest that the parents are feeling? That would be a thick question because some people might say they're angry, some people might say the parents are sad, a combination of both. And you could use this because mutilated with scissors and stabbed is more of an aggression. Same with the cigarette burns. However, some people act sad. They might do things like that. So that's where the thick question comes in. Nightmares about Mr. Zamora stalking him through the Philippine jungle joined those about the detention center. Entering the courthouse for his second hearing, the latest dream of being beaten by a circle of inmates recurred to him. He passed a young man, his arms swarming with tattoos, whom he was certain he'd seen in the dream. He and his parents found their room. The psychologist spoke, then the lawyers. Brent suddenly wondered if Mr. Zamora might be there. He was trying to scan the faces to his rear when his father squeezed his forearm. The judge was addressing him, sentencing him to probation in place of the detention center. His parents beamed. He felt relief, but also an unanswered hunger. So I'm going to pause there and ask you to think about how you feel about the judge's sentencing. So again, this is a thick question. It's based on your prior knowledge of, say, detention centers, which we do have in South Portland, the youth center. It's also based on your understanding of, how you would feel if somebody killed someone that you loved and they were drinking and driving. It also requires your prior knowledge of the law. So take a moment and determine whether you agree or disagree with the judge's sentencing. Okay. Brent realized he wanted a punishment. He knew also that, grim as the detention center might be, he'd have welcomed the chance to leave his family and his previous life behind. The listing of the terms of his probation hardly registered to him. Alcohol counseling, therapy for depression, volunteering in an emergency room. Then the judge came to the final item, meeting with the victim's family if they desired to discuss restitution. Now, restitution is a way of making something up to somebody else. Sometimes when you vandalize property, restitution is cleaning that property or painting it. Brent knew the meeting would never take place, an outcome that once again left him both relieved and unsatisfied. He wanted to do something for the family. 2 days later, the probation officer called. The victim's mother had agreed to talk with him. The meeting was scheduled in a building downtown. Entering, Brent wished his parents weren't with him. The room was spacious and had a view of Lake Michigan. Miss Gill, young and black and soft-voiced, was there to serve as mediator. A few minutes later, Mrs. Zamora arrived. Not the tiny Asian woman Brent had pictured, but a heavy-set redhead in an India print skirt. Among the dozen necklaces jangling on her chest, Brent picked out pendant of an astrological sign and a Native American sun symbol. Her wavy hair flowed exuberantly over her shoulders. The rest of her seemed only half alive. She navigated the introductions with an eerie, ethereal calm. Brent gazed openly into her face, offering himself up to her, and noticed that her eyes were slightly bloodshot. Those eyes searched his own, then released him. How strange, he thought, that he'd somehow caused this woman, whom he never met, to cry. "We're meeting today," said Miss Gill, "to apologize and to understand and to atone." Her voice was hopeful rather than accusing. "We never know all the consequences of our acts. They reach into places we can't see, and into the future where no one can." I want you to take your pencil and I want you to underline on page 38 where it says, "We never know all the consequences of our acts. They reach into places we can't see and into the future where no one can." Because I have a feeling that it has something to do with actions have consequences, which is a major theme of this novel. She looked at Brent, then invited Mrs. Zamora to describe the results of Leah's death. "When the phone rang," she began, "I was sorting through lentils to soak for soup the next day." Her voice had a faint flutter to it. Eyes down, she continued her detailed, dispassionate account of the night and the days that followed, of her husband smashing a wooden chair in his rage, the younger children's endless crying, her sleeplessness, the thought of killing herself to be with Leah, the voice from Leah's photo saying no. Brent closed his eyes. What murderous machine had he constructed and set in motion? When his turn finally came to speak, the long apology he'd rehearsed reduced itself to the two words, "I'm sorry." Words he spoke over and over, then wailed miserably through tears, not caring that his parents were watching. Miss Gill spoke for a while. When it came to discuss restitution, Brent saw his father shift nervously. The Zamoras hadn't sued. Apparently they were content with the insurance company's payment. His father had brought his checkbook just in case. Brent spied the silver pen beside it in his jacket's inside pocket, stationed like a butler awaiting command. Miss Gill reviewed various possibilities. A written apology to each family member, service to a charity of the Zamora's choice, service to the Zamoras themselves. Whatever it might be would have to be agreeable to both parties. I'm going to stop here and have you guys reflect on what we just read. And I will see you for our next reading session to continue and finish the chapter called The Afterlife. Bye.